great damage. Dozens of Putin's tank battalions were eliminated due to inefficient operation.
The deplorable state of the Russian army is a complete disaster for Putin now. The size of the Russian losses is so huge that it has lost more than what was in the army arsenal of two countries of average. Thanks according to the latest data of the Ukrainian armed forces, the loss of the Russian soldiers has exceeded 50,500. This indicates that at least 5 dozen to 7 dozen Russian tactical battalion groups were destroyed. This number of troop casualties is more than the combined armies of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Also, the main motivation of the Russian army was Putin's tanks, known as the Iron Fist Russian tanks. The Ukrainian armed forces are advancing with both airstrikes, artillery strikes, and ground special operations forces and elite Marines units. The only physical cost of the 7-month resistance and offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces to the Russian army was 2,097 tanks, 4,520 armored combat vehicles, 237 warplanes, and 208 combat helicopters. The most notable losses here, of course, are the tanks the Russian army sent to Ukraine, an upgraded T-72B3 version of the Soviet ERA T-72 tanks. However, many of these tanks were probably destroyed so that the Russian army was then forced to send in the 50-year-old T-64. It also sent hundreds of T-8 variants and dozens of T-9 T3rd-generation main battle tanks. But more than 2,000 of these tanks are now rusty iron piles on the meadows and streets of Ukraine or are on public display in Kiev. A Russian rank regiment in the Army Order of the Russian Federation consists of 3 tank battalions and has about 93 tanks in the 3 battalions and a mechanized infantry battalion mounted on BMP infantry fighting vehicles, or IFV, usually about 4,248 Uyghurs. So a Russian tank battalion consists of an average 30 tanks and 16 armored vehicles. Now let me tell you a terrifying number. The loss of 2,100 tanks represents the average loss of 70 Russian tank battalions or 23 Russian tank regiments. Although the loss of armored combat vehicles is huge, it is somewhat pointless and imprecise to calculate how many battalions there are, because the Russian battalion tactical group has an average of 40 armored vehicles and between 600 and 800 soldiers. In addition, there are around 16 armored vehicles in a tank battalion, and the diversity of these armored vehicles is very high in an army like Russia. Regardless, this loss in the Russian army is much more than the total volume of tanks and armored vehicles of more than 95% of the armies in the world. US and UK intelligence confirmed that Russia has suffered more than 80,000 casualties or injuries since the beginning of its attempted invasion of Ukraine, resulting in the loss of thousands of armored vehicles. U.S. Undersecretary of Defense Colin Kahl said these estimates are quite remarkable, given that the Russians failed to achieve any of Vladimir Putin's goals at the beginning of the war. When the Kremlin first invaded Ukraine in February, Russian forces launched offensive bombardments, primarily using tanks to carry out artillery, rocket, and missile strikes against the Ukrainians. However, as the war progresses, Moscow continues to lose more and more tanks, forcing its soldiers to re-strategize. However, the Russian army, which is losing more and more strategically every day, shows a great failure to prevent losses. End of August was 6 months of bloodshed due to Russia's mass invasion of sovereign Ukraine. The attempt to take over Ukraine, labeled a so-called special military operation by Russian President Vladimir Putin, was the largest of its kind in Europe since World War II. The use of battle tanks by both sides during the ongoing conflicts suggests that this style of warfare may not hold such a great position in forward-looking modern conventional conflicts, as the war exposes the weak points of such vehicles. Russia's self-proclaimed first-class main battle tank, the T-90, is not exempt from these shortcomings. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow has prioritized advancing and expanding. Special Tank Fleet The T-90 is Russia's latest premier MBT, and it's considered a formidable vehicle by industry and military experts alike. Additionally, the T-90 is the most commercially successful MBT on the world market and has been acquired by Azerbaijan, Algeria, and Venezuela. Produced at the Uralvagon Zavid plant since the early 1990s, the T-90 has many advanced features that distinguish it from its predecessors. This advanced MBT can launch the 9M119 reflex anti-tank guided missile system made to strike explosively reactive armored tanks or helicopters. While the T-90 was touted by Russia as the backbone of its ground forces, the MBT did not fold up well during the Ukrainian offensive. Part of Russia's MBT fleet did not even survive the first week of the war. Due to the T-90's poor performance, Russian forces had to rely on their aging fleet and highly vulnerable platforms to make up for MBT losses. However, we have all observed that any military equipment of the Russian army did not succeed in the land campaign. The tanks showed an exhausted performance, but it's not just them. Warships at sea and warplanes in the air have turned Putin into a mess. Continuing with the details of the destruction of the Russian tank battalions, in June, the UK Ministry of Defense confirmed footage showing Russian T-62 tanks traveling through Ukraine. The inclusion of the second-generation main battle tank did not improve Russia's overall capabilities. While the T-62 has undergone some improvements over the years to improve its combat survivability, this platform remains an inferior variant in Russia's MB-2 arsenal. While Russia is experiencing a complete loss in Ukraine, it is also struggling with problems within its own borders. Increasing rebel movements and anti-Putin partisans are nearing the end of the Russian president as Vladimir Putin acknowledges that the forest fires in Russia could escalate. His efforts to invade Ukraine face problems, as well as a local environmental war, as well as the outbreak of Russian Popular Uprising partisan movements and protests. Russia's annual wildfire season has gotten worse in recent years, often due to the effects of climate change. Putin admitted that forest fires threaten to further devastate Russia's borders closest to Europe. It also identified the far eastern regions of Russia where devastating wildfires have traditionally been difficult, according to a statement attributed to Russia's Federal Forest Agency. Local authorities have declared a state of emergency. In hopes of preventing a recurrence of the 2021 crisis, Greenpeace Russia described last year's forest fires in the northeast of the country as catastrophic. In other words, Russia is getting serious reactions from both inside and outside. Putin especially feels the squeak of his swaying throne, especially in the area where Putin's iron fist is so helpless that glass throne can be destroyed much more easily with this success. Green showed all the armies of the world that Russian armored vehicles and tanks are really a bloat and their true value. Still, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is nothing to brag about, and there will never be a winner here. The victims are humans, and both Ukrainians and Russians are extras in the brutal game of a dictator who has been enslaved by their own greed. We hope that the Ukrainians will expel the invaders from their lands as soon as possible and achieve peace and freedom. Thanks for watching.